been holding hearts before charts, before meds had names, we had compassion. This one's for every nurse, past, present, and future. Let's go.
We are the calm in the storm, the beacon of hope. Every beat, every breath, we honor the oath. From night shifts to day breaks, loving our tone. Peplau taught us, connection heals more than alone. From Florence to futures, we redefine care, not just meds and machines. We're presence of prayer, with hands that comfort, eyes that see truth. Healing ain't a chart, notice what we do. We are nurses, we're hearts wide open.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Peplau's Ghosts. I am Dan Weisman. I am joined by the ever-present Dr. Sean Conboy and Dr. Kate Molino. And we are thrilled to have another international guest on our podcast. I'm super excited to introduce Mr. Nathan Dart, soon to be Dr. Nathan Dart, as I hear. So congratulations early on that. He serves as the Director of Nursing at the Metro North Mental Health and the Board Director. We're just talking the second year as the Australian College of Mental Health Nurses. As you will hear soon with the accent, although he tells me I have an accent, I don't hear it, but I hear his accent. You'll hear his accent as well. You'll understand that he does practice and is an established and senior nurse leader down from Australia. So I'm really excited to get to know his perspective on mental health nursing, psychiatric mental health nursing, and how advanced practice nurses operate down in Australia. So maybe that's where I'll start off with a little bit, as I think one of the passions that we've had for this podcast in Peplau's Ghost is to really kind of pay homage to the ghost of Hildegard Peplau. And I should ask, Nathan, do you know who Hildegard Peplau is? And I apologize if that's a very offensive question. I don't know if she's just US-centric or not.
No, it's not US-centric. It's, it's a part of our curriculum and, it's foundational in a lot of the work or in our education system here for mental health nursing.
Wonderful. Good. I know she's in Europe as well, and people kind of know, but thank you again. I didn't mean to be offensive, but again, with Hildegard and kind of her idea of really kind of keeping the interpersonal and relationship part of the work that we do very integral. Do you mind sharing kind of how advanced practice nurses are utilized, or, what's on the, how they're currently being seen and maybe utilized within the healthcare system in Australia?
So within our context here in Australia, I think, advanced practice nursing is really starting to take off. I guess, nurse practitioner models are really something that the government is investing in. I guess one of the biggest difference is the majority of our mental health services here in Australia are publicly funded. So a lot of services, people access, via government funding. I guess nurse practitioner models is something that is really probably in the last 3 to 5 years are really starting to grow legs. And, I think with the international shortage of medical staff, it's been an opportune time for us to look at nurse-led models of care. So a lot of community services are moving to including nurse practitioners. That doesn't mean that mental health nurses that aren't nurse practitioners don't play a pivotal role. But yeah, that's probably one of the biggest differences in how services are provided.
Super. So it sounds like the federal government is kind of having a real push on getting nurses more involved in kind of those advanced practice roles. So in the United States, there, like I said, this podcast has been kind of, I think, a passion project for us as far as the over dependence on prescribing medication. In Australia, do advanced practice psych mental health nurses, do they prescribe medications? Is there have to be a relationship with a physician, or how does that all look, Nathan?
I think there's a combination of both. So nurse practitioners have prescribing rights, so they can prescribe medication. I guess if you're not a nurse practitioner, Australia has just passed legislation which will see registered nurse prescribing. It's very early in that game, so we just don't know how that will play out from a practical point on the ground. I guess we use a very multidisciplinary team model, which is usually medically led, but we are seeing a shift into more autonomous nurse-led models of care. I mean, an example of that is in my service, we're trialing nurse-led clozapine clinics so that it's therapeutic, it's looking after physical health, it's doing the metabolic requirements and the prescribing. Now that is early days, so there is still some medical governance, but we might see a shift in that as, we prove that model really works. But I guess the model is underpinned by that relational well-being, not just the medication prescribing itself. And we see that as, less fragmented. So, we used to have care coordination, or we still have care coordination, but now we're trialing, the clinician-led relationship with the patient, and that's ongoing. Early indications are that's really beneficial, and more from the relational side, and increased adherence to a medication that's high risk, but does work in a population that need it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. That's awesome. I love that kind of wraparound type of thing. So that's awesome. Sean, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, Nathan, question for you. Imagine the ghost of Hildegard Peplau is hovering over your shoulder as you execute your daily duties as both a nurse clinician and nurse leader. What do you suspect she would say you're doing well in Australia, and what do you suspect she would suggest you need to improve upon?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
What we're doing well is really trying to make mental health nurses, more therapeutic. So trying to reduce the fragmentation in our system. So our systems are big, they're complex, patients move between different parts of the system. So we're really trying to move from case management and task-orientated to care coordination, which would see, mental health nurses and our allied health colleagues being central into providing care, not just providing case management. I guess we're investing a lot in a therapeutic model. We've just appointed a director of therapies so that we move from being risk-adverse assessment-based services to actually providing an intervention, and that those interventions are therapeutic in nature. So investing quite heavily in suicide prevention models. We use zero suicide where I work, so that it's assessment, it's formulation, it's safety planning that's very practical and interventional. So I think we're moving in the right direction in trying to be, as I said, more therapeutic. I guess the negative, or what we're not doing well, is we haven't got that right yet. The system is so big, it's stretched, demand is high, and we're working hard on getting that more coordinated, but, there are challenges with that as well. We're moving to increase access to DBT clinics or DBT-like services. So again, it's more evidence-based rather than just, I don't know what the word is, but so it's more bang for buck. I think as services we've been very risk adverse, and we I remember sitting with a family and talking to them about their experience with our service, and it was the acute care team came around 3 times in the week, and it was just assessment and questions. So moving from assessment and questions to what can we practically do to move things forward and reduce reliance on mental health services and empower patients to get better.
Nate, it sounds like we have some similar challenges, and I'll tell you, one thing a mentor of mine once said is, Sean, you have to take an appetite suppressant for change, that more often than not, these big systems issues are like turning around an aircraft carrier. So thank you. Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'd like to build on something you said, Nathan, which is about, creating opportunities for nurses to be more therapeutic. And so I'm curious to know a little bit about you. How has your understanding of therapeutic use of self evolved from your early days in training to today as a leader in the field?
Some questions. I think, as I'm 25 years into my career. I think every interaction you have with a patient, you learn something about them, but you also learn something about yourself. And when I say that, you learn something about that interaction, or how you've crafted the conversation to make that assessment or offer, some sort of insight for them. And I think, that's how you get your experience. So it's more about that reflective practice around how you manage different conversations with different patients, and everyone comes from a different angle or a different socioeconomic background, and that really has to guide your practice and how you engage with that particular individual. I remember, a patient who was really quite unwell and a lot of self-injurious behaviours, and the emotion that can rise in a clinician. And 10 years later, to see the same patient doing advocacy work with a real change in lifestyle and life, and a better life. And she talks about that one interaction. So she's probably had thousands of interactions with a mental health nurse, a psychiatrist, but she talks about the one interaction that made change. So I think when I talk to patients, and I do that less these days, but when I do, it's about this could be that interaction for that person. So there's always got to be holding their hope, and it might transfer. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, this is good because it's getting more to kind of understanding, because I know my next question kind of goes into that a little bit more about like a medical diagnosis. When we look at a patient, we have to kind of be with them for a certain amount of time, and then we have to make an assessment and a diagnosis very quickly. Can you kind of share a little bit about what you do as far as maybe looking past any biological data, and trying to find the human being within that person that maybe Peplau was talking about, keeping that at the center of our work? How do you kind of get to know that person and know what's important to them?
I think our system here in Australia is a little bit biological in sense. So funding is, based on hitting, certain diagnosis, interactions, service provision, and that all goes into an algorithm and spits out the funding at the end of the day. I think that's the task-orientated stuff we do as clinicians because it's required. But, anyone can have a diagnosis, but their personal circumstances, where they're at, what they're thinking is very individualized to them. So that needs to be at the core of discussion. And I think, when you're looking after people, you want to understand, what's going on for them right now and what we can do to help regardless of diagnosis, but also, what is their future goals and how can we develop a plan to sort of get to that endpoint. And that may not necessarily be diagnosis driven. So in the back of the mind, you've got the diagnosis and how we can get them as well as possible. That may or may not include medication. But I think the interaction needs to be centered about where they're at, where they want to go, and what's the journey, and how can we break that into pieces so that they've got achievable goals until you sort of catch up next time. So, you've got to balance your knowledge as a clinician with, what their recovery goals are, I guess. And, sometimes that may not align with your own values, but it's where they want to be or where they want to get to. And, we sort of hold their hope and get on the journey with them. And sometimes that's easy and sometimes that's very difficult.
Yeah, it reminds me, I had a professor that I looked up to quite significantly, and he was applying for federal big grants funding and things, and he would always be looking at these outcomes, and he always felt like he had to put some biological thing in there. So he was measuring cortisol levels, so kind of saliva based cortisol levels, and he always felt that was kind of always a bit kind of an add-on part of his research, but he knew he could get funded kind of at a federal and kind of the bigger grants that were looking at some sort of biological data. but it's always been, and that's been the struggle. Some of the reading I've been doing lately too is just, are we looking at the right thing? When we treat someone with depression or schizophrenia or whatever diagnosis we want to say, are we looking at the right outcomes? Is this, shouldn't we look at the person more than just, getting a PHQ-9 that's, decreased or something like that? So yeah, thanks, Nathan. I appreciate your perspective.
Yeah, I think it can be a combination of both.
Yeah. Nathan, I'm gonna shift gears and kind of bring this more closer to your actual clinical practice. You said you've been practicing as a psychiatric nurse for 25 years. That's incredible. Can you reflect on a specific psychotherapeutic experience you've had over the years with a patient that crystallized to you the inherent value of the therapeutic relationship? De-identify it and tell us the story.
I can remember being a new graduate nurse on a ward and a patient with, quite a complex, severe eating disorder and self-harm. And I can remember, recall as a junior clinician how frustrating and how disturbing that was to be a part of, and, sort of the pain and the anguish and the trauma background that this young person had, and not knowing at times what to say, what to do, and sort of just being an onlooker as a clinician, or a very inexperienced clinician. And then sort of fast forward a few years, the same patient was still a real part of the system, and we talk about revolving doors coming in and out. And then I moved from inpatient setting and was working in the community where this young lady was a patient, and having to look after her with a little bit more experience and trying to really understand her history, her trauma. And, we did some good work, and, she went about 8 to 12 months before having another relapse and requiring inpatient care. And then after that inpatient setting moved away, and I didn't see her again. And then I saw her in a social setting about 5 years after that. And to have a conversation with the next patient in a social setting that hadn't been to hospital for 4 years and had really, taken charge of her own life and got employment, and, there were still struggles, but hadn't been in hospital that long. And, you don't at that particular juncture think that you've offered much. But to see someone in a social setting and for them to say, thank you, you were a part of their recovery, I think that's probably one of the most rewarding feedback loops that you don't expect. And someone that, you had a long interaction with, and starting as a junior clinician, and, that transference, that frustration, that, why are you doing this, and not really understanding that as a junior clinician, and then working through some of that as a more experienced clinician in a community setting, and then losing touch. But that feedback loop, I think that's probably, one of the situations I really reflect on.
Thank you for that, Nathan. I'm thinking about what you just said, and I'm thinking about what Dan previously talked about in terms of how we relatively value unit our role. And it's reminding me of a quote from William Cameron. I think he said something to the effect of, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that counts should be counted. What you did there, that needs to be counted. Thanks. Kate?
Thank you. What an incredible example. Nathan, my question for you is, you've talked a lot about how advanced practice psychiatric nursing in Australia is changing and growing and so on. And looking at the landscape of psychiatric nursing over the next 10 years, what is one quote unquote traditional skill that you fear we might be losing as psych nurses? And what is one modern innovation that you're excited to embrace?
In the Australian context, we are growing rapidly. So, in Victoria, we've had, a few years ago, a Royal Commission into mental health. Here in Queensland, closer to home, we've had parliamentary inquiry into public mental health services. And I guess the purpose of both of those reviews were to try and fix what's broken in a very large and complex system. So what that has resulted in is huge funding reform. And, as a director of nursing, we are growing rapidly, but the pipeline is very junior clinicians coming into our service. So, that's challenging because, with the aging population of nurses or mental health nurses, they're exiting the system because they're old and they're retiring. So that ability for more experienced nurses to pass on their skill set to our more junior clinicians, so I fear we're losing that transfer of skills rapidly, and then, that therapeutic use of self. And it's challenging to support and grow and educate, because a lot of the work we do, I believe, you look at skilled nurses around you and you take the best of what they do and you put it in your toolkit, and that's how you develop your clinical skills moving forward. So I do fear that the rapid growth is really challenging our system. But I remain optimistic as we, in Australia, the work the college is doing, our credentialing for mental health nurses to sort of retain that specialist skill and, that professional identity. I do have hope, but I do balance that with the reality of what we're dealing with in services. One of the biggest innovations for us is, our transition support program, and, we're really developing a pathway to practice, which is, embedding that postgraduate mental health nursing into our expectations as clinicians, grow and progress through their career. So again, I think it's the same. The challenge is our rapid growth, and the investment's very needed. But, with that rapid growth, how do we make sure that the mental health nursing product that we're developing is of a high quality? That is a challenge and a risk, but it's also an opportunity. And I guess it's how we use that opportunity to make sure that we're at the core of, system reform.
It sounds like such an exciting time. And like you said, it's a real opportunity to be very intentional about how to build this out too. And I also am imagining that this might be a focus of conversation that is related to the background on your Zoom screen right now that our listeners can't see, but wondering if you wanted to speak about that a little bit.
So, very proud board director of the Australian College of Mental Health Nurses. I guess that in Australia is our professional organisation. So being a part of that is an absolute honour for me. And we are celebrating 50 years as an organisation this year. And our conference is going to celebrate that 50 years in Adelaide between the 7th and the 9th of October. And for those that don't know Australia well, Adelaide is extremely renowned as, the best wine growing country. So hopefully it'll be a good exchange of professional ideas and innovations with a nice Barossa Valley.
Love it. That's great. You should have that on a t-shirt for sure. That's going to draw lots of registrants for your conference. So yeah, thank you. And maybe just to kind of wrap up this podcast, which again, thank you, Nathan, for your time. I know it's really early in Australia while we're recording this. So thank you for that and sacrificing a little bit of your Saturday. But, talking about organizations, I know one of the places where we first met was with the International Council of Mental Health Nurses in Barcelona. We talked a little bit about this with Rhonda and Oliver that we had on a previous podcast. But what are your hopes and excitements about that organization? And if you could, as we sometimes say, your crystal ball of looking to the future of that organization, what do you hope develops from this? And what are your dreams and aspirations related to the International Council on Mental Health Nurses?
Yeah, my hopes and dreams is that the International Council grows legs, early indications from around the globe, and Dan, you were a pivotal part of this, is that it will slowly but surely over time form, and we can have a voice and an identity that will see mental health and nursing. That's our term here in Australia, but psychiatric nursing is what you guys use. But, being a powerful, recognised discipline within its own right, that is a part of the broader international system, and not just watching from the sidelines.
Yeah, having a seat at the table has always been something that I think nurses have done and have done very well. And so this is just another opportunity for that. So Nathan, thank you for your time. And yeah, thank you so much. And you've really inspired me. Your passion, comes across very clearly. And so thank you very much. Thank you for all who's listening. Appreciate it. Please drop in, like, share, subscribe to the podcast. We'll have new episodes coming out shortly. But thank you again to soon-to-be Dr. Nathan Dart. And see us next on a new episode. Take care.
Carrying the torch through the blood and the rain. We are nurses, the world can't forget. We give our all, no regrets. Modern in our ways, but our roots don't decay. Nurses anthem and it's here to stay. We are nurses.
So here's to the hands that heal, the hearts that stay steady, the voices that whisper you're not alone. Because nursing isn't just what we do, it's who we are.